The wind on the high plains of Montana was a lonely sound. It was the only voice Eli Carter heard most days, a constant, sighing whisper that swept down from the jagged teeth of the mountains and scoured the grasslands bare. It carved the lines deeper into the corners of his eyes and carried the scent of dust, pine, and the vast, empty sky. For 5 years. This solitude had been his penance. His ranch was little more than a sturdy cabin, a half-finished barn, and 100 head of cattle that drifted across the plains like a slow, brown river. It was enough. He worked from can't see to can't see, his hands raw and calloused, his body aching with the clean pain of labor. The work was a blessing. It was honest and hard, and it left him too tired at night for much else than falling into his cot. His mind blessedly empty, but sometimes, in the dead quiet just before sleep, the memories would come for him. They always started with the same sound, the splintering crack of a chair leg against bone, the roar of a saloon gone wild, and the hollow, sick feeling of being too slow, too late. Thomas, his younger brother's name, was a ghost on his tongue. Thomas, with his quick grin and quicker temper, who had seen a slight where there was none and had thrown a punch that started a war. Eli had been there, standing at the bar, and he'd frozen. For a single, damning second. He had weighed the odds, had hesitated to step into a brawl that wasn't his. By the time he moved, Thomas was on the floor, a boot crushing his throat, the life squeezed out of him in a froth of beer and blood. Eli had carried his brother's body out of that saloon, the sudden silence of the room more deafening than the riot that had killed him. He had buried him, sold their father's farm, and ridden west until the world felt big enough to swallow his guilt. He had not raised his fists to another man since. Fights were for fools and dead men. Gossip was the same, just a different kind of poison. Eli wanted no part of either. He rode into the town of Redemption once a month for supplies. The name was a bitter joke. The town was a collection of dusty streets and false-fronted buildings huddled together against the endless prairie, held together by judgment and suspicion. Its people were pious on Sundays and cruel the rest of the week, their whispers as sharp as shattered glass. On a raw afternoon in late autumn, Eli was in Miller's Mercantile, the air thick with the smell of coffee beans, cured leather, and Mrs. Miller's lavender water. He was counting out coins for flour and salt when he heard the voices from the next aisle, low and venomous. "A disgrace to her father's name," one woman clucked. It was Harriet Gable, the blacksmith's wife, a woman whose face seemed permanently pinched from smelling something foul. "Right under his own roof, the Lord's house." "And now look at her," another voice, softer but no less cutting, chimed in. "Swollen up with sin for the whole world to see. He did right to cast her out. The good book is clear on such matters." Eli kept his head down, focusing on the worn wooden counter. He knew who they were talking about. It was the only story that had mattered in Redemption for the last 2 months. Mara, the daughter of the town's fire and brimstone preacher, Reverend Brown. She had been the town's ideal, pious, quiet, with eyes the color of a summer sky. Then, her belly had begun to round, and her father, a man who spoke of God's mercy but showed none, had disowned her on the church steps in front of the entire congregation. "Living in that old trapper's shack by the creek," Harriet Gable continued, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "With winter coming on, serves her right. I say, the wages of sin." Eli's jaw tightened. He remembered Mara from a distance, a girl with a quiet smile who always seemed to be looking at something far away. He remembered the rigid set of her shoulders as she walked through town, her gaze fixed forward, pretending not to hear the whispers that followed her like flies. The image of his brother's face, pale and still, flashed in his mind. He had done nothing then. He hated the weakness he felt now, the familiar urge to turn away, to ride back to his quiet plains and let the world handle its own ugliness. But the women's voices grated on him, their sanctimonious certainty a burr under his skin. He paid for his supplies, his movements stiff. Outside, the wind bit at his cheeks. Instead of mounting his horse, he slung the heavy sack of flour over his shoulder and turned his steps toward the creek on the edge of town. He told himself it was just a neighborly thing to do, a simple act of decency. It had nothing to do with the ghost of his brother. The shack was worse than he had imagined. It leaned to one side as if tired, the chinking between the logs crumbling away, the roof patched with rusting scraps of tin. A thin curl of smoke rose from the mud and stick chimney, a fragile sign of life against the gray sky. He saw her then, splitting wood with a dull axe, her movements clumsy and slow. Her condition was plain to see. Her worn dress stretched tight over her belly. Her face, when she looked up at the sound of his approach, was pale and thin, but her eyes held no plea. They were proud, guarded, and weary. He stopped a dozen feet away, feeling like an intruder. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He set the sack of flour on the ground, along with a smaller bag of salt pork and beans. "Figured you might have use for these." Mara stared at the sacks, then back at him, her chin lifted. "I don't take charity. Mr. Carter—" Her voice was low but steady, without a trace of the shame he'd expected. He felt a flush of respect for her. He also felt like a fool. "It ain't charity," he said gruffly. "It's an advance." She raised an eyebrow. "An advance for what?" The idea came to him then, unbidden and simple. "I need help at my place. Cooking, tending the cabin. The work's piling up. I can pay a fair wage." She studied his face, her gaze searching and intense, looking for the pity or the lust she must have seen in the eyes of other men. Eli met her gaze squarely, keeping his own expression neutral, hoping she could not see the guilt and loneliness that drove him. He was offering a job, nothing more, a way to quiet the voices in his own head. After a long silence, she gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I can cook," she said, "and I am not afraid of work." She did not thank him. She simply picked up the smaller bags, leaving the heavy flour sack for him. "When do I start?" The gossip in redemption turned from a simmer to a boil. Eli Carter, the quiet rancher who kept to himself, had taken in the fallen woman. Tongues wagged over fences and in the pews. They said he was a sinner taking advantage of a desperate girl. They said she was a harlot who had shrewdly seduced a lonely man for a roof over her head. The story twisted and darkened with every telling, until Eli's simple offer of a job became a sordid tale of depravity. He ignored it, just as he ignored the cold shoulders he received at the mercantile and the way men at the saloon would stop talking when he entered. He gave Mara the small sleeping loft in his cabin, a cramped space under the eaves he'd used for storage. He took his bedroll and slept on the floor by the hearth. He was careful to maintain a distance between them, a formal courtesy that felt both necessary and strained in the small cabin. Their days fell into a quiet rhythm. He would be gone before sunrise, checking the herd, mending fences. He would return at dusk, bone-weary, to the smell of stew and fresh bread and the sight of Mara sitting by the fire, mending his torn shirts. She was not what he expected. There was no trace of the broken, shamed creature the town imagined. She was strong, her spirit as unyielding as the frozen prairie earth. She worked without complaint, her hands, once soft, growing rough and capable. But it was in the evenings that he began to see the woman behind the town's scarlet letter. They would sit on opposite sides of the hearth, the firelight casting dancing shadows on the log walls. Their conversations started small, careful explorations of a shared solitude. They spoke of the weather, the price of cattle, the way the mountains looked at sunset. Slowly, cautiously, the talk deepened. He found himself telling her about his family's farm back in Missouri, the green hills and the muddy rivers, a world away from this stark, beautiful land. He spoke of his father, a stern but fair man, and his mother, who had died when he was a boy. He never mentioned Thomas. That wound was his alone. In turn, Mara spoke of her childhood as a preacher's daughter, a life lived in a glass house, every action scrutinized. She spoke of her love for books and her quiet rebellion in reading novels her father had forbidden. She spoke of her mother, a gentle soul who had withered under the weight of her husband's rigid faith. In her voice, Eli heard not just sadness, but a deep, simmering anger at the injustice of it all. He saw the fire in her, the pride that refused to be extinguished. He began to look forward to the evenings, to the quiet understanding that grew between them in the flickering light, a fragile connection forged in the heart of their shared isolation. One night, a storm rolled in, a blizzard that howled like a hungry wolf outside the cabin walls. The wind rattled the windows and drove snow through the cracks in the logs. The world shrank to the small, warm circle of the hearth. The fury of the storm seemed to break something loose in Mara. She sat staring into the flames, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, her knuckles white. "He told me he loved me," she said suddenly, her voice so low Eli had to lean forward to hear. "He was a surveyor for the railroad. He was only here for a month." Eli said nothing, sensing that she needed the silence to let the words out. "His name was John. That's all I knew. John. He had a laugh that made you want to laugh with him. And he didn't talk about God or sin. He talked about cities back east, about the future." Her voice broke. "He promised he would send for me. He promised." A tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. Then another, soon. Her shoulders were shaking with silent, racking sobs. She cried for the man who had vanished, for the promises that had turned to dust, for the life that had been stolen from her. She cried for the child growing inside her, a child who would be born into a world that had already condemned it. Eli's first instinct was to stay put, to respect the wall of distance he had so carefully built, but the sound of her grief was too raw, too real. It echoed the silent sobs he had choked down at his brother's graveside. He moved from his chair and knelt on the hearth beside her. Awkwardly, he put a hand on her shoulder. She flinched, then leaned into his touch, turning and burying her face in the rough wool of his shirt. He held her as she cried, his arms wrapping around her, one hand stroking her hair. It was not the touch of a man with a woman. It was the touch of one broken soul comforting another. He offered no words, no empty platitudes. He just held her, a solid, steady presence against the storm inside and out. And in that closeness, with the scent of wood smoke and tears filling his senses, something shifted inside him. The wall he had built around his heart did not crumble, but a small, forgotten gate creaked open. He was no longer just her employer, and she was no longer just a woman he had pitied. They were two people clinging to a piece of driftwood in a raging sea. The baby came early. 2 weeks later, on a night when the cold was so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. Mara's water broke with a sudden gush, and her gasp of pain and fear cut through the quiet cabin. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Eli. He was a cattleman, not a midwife. He knew the signs of a cow in labor, but this was different. This was Mara. He pushed the fear down, his hands moving with a purpose he didn't feel. He stoked the fire until it roared, and put every kettle and pot he owned on to boil. He tore up his cleanest shirts for rags. Mara's face was slick with sweat, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his own. Her pains came hard and fast, wrenching guttural cries from her. Between the contractions, she would lie limp, her breath coming in shallow pants. Eli did what he could. He wiped her brow, gave her sips of water, and held her hand, his own large, calloused grip swallowing hers. He spoke to her in a low, steady murmur, the words meaningless, the tone everything. He was a rock for her to cling to as the waves of agony crashed over her. Hours blurred into a nightmare of sweat, blood, and pain. The cabin, once his sanctuary, became a crucible. Just before dawn, with a final, desperate cry that seemed to tear the soul from her body, the baby was born. It was a boy, impossibly small, his skin a translucent, bluish white. His cry was not a cry at all, but a thin, weak mewing, like a lost kitten. Eli wrapped him in the warmest wool blanket he had and placed him on Mara's chest. She looked down at her son, her face a mask of exhaustion and fierce, radiant love. "Daniel," she whispered, her fingers tracing the outline of his tiny head. "His name is Daniel." But the cold of the world had already claimed him. He was too small, his lungs too weak to draw a real breath in the frigid air. Eli watched, helpless, as the baby's faint struggles ceased, as the faint blush of life faded from his tiny limbs. He died in his mother's arms, within an hour of his birth, his life a brief, flickering candle flame snuffed out by the unforgiving Montana winter. The silence that fell was heavier than any sound. It was the silence of a life that never was, of a hope turned to ash. Mara did not scream or rage. A low, keening wail escaped her lips, a sound of such profound, animal grief that it clawed at Eli's soul. She clutched the tiny, still form to her chest, rocking back and forth, her whispers of "no, no, no" lost in the vast, indifferent quiet. Something inside Eli broke, the carefully constructed dam that held back his own grief, his own guilt, shattered. He saw Thomas's face. He saw this tiny, innocent boy. He saw a world full of pain that he was powerless to stop. He stumbled out of the cabin into the biting, pre-dawn cold. The ground was frozen solid, hard as iron. He fetched a pickaxe, but the blade glanced off the earth with a useless clang. Cursing, he threw the tool aside. A wild, desperate fury seized him. He fell to his knees and began to dig with his bare hands, clawing at the frozen dirt like a madman. He scraped and tore at the unyielding ground, his fingernails splitting, his knuckles bleeding. The pain was a release, a penance. With every handful of icy earth, he was digging a grave not just for the child, but for his own failure, for his brother, for the crushing weight of all the things he could not fix. When the hole was finally deep enough, he went back inside. He gently took the small, blanket-wrapped bundle from Mara's unresisting arms. She followed him out, a ghost in the gray light, her face hollowed out by a sorrow too deep for tears. They buried the child together, under a lone pine tree on a small rise overlooking the creek. There was no prayer, no ceremony, just the soft thud of frozen earth on a small blanket. When it was done, Mara collapsed against him, her body shaking with tremors that had nothing to do with the cold. He led her back to the cabin and sat her by the fire. She wept then, not the wrenching sobs of before, but a slow, silent cascade of tears that seemed to have no end. She wept into his chest, and he held her, his own tears falling silently into her hair. They mourned together in the dim light, their shared grief a bond stronger than steel. That night, exhaustion fell over them like a shroud. Eli laid his bedroll by the fire as usual, but the distance between them felt like a lie. The space was filled with the ghost of a child and the echo of a mother's wail. He lay staring into the dying embers, the events of the day playing over and over in his mind. He felt Mara's eyes on him from the cot where she lay. "Eli," she whispered, her voice a raw thread of sound. He turned his head. In the faint glow of the coals, he saw the desolation in her face. "Don't leave me alone," she pleaded. He rose from his bedroll and went to her. He lay down on the cot beside her, on top of the blankets, his boots still on. He had intended only to offer the simple comfort of his presence. But she turned to him, her cold hands finding his, her body pressing against his for warmth, for life, for anything to push back the encroaching darkness. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close. Her breath hitched, and his own heart ached with a pain that was both hers and his. In their shared sorrow, in their desperate need for human connection in the face of death, they found an unexpected solace. It was not born of passion, but of a profound, aching tenderness. Their coming together was a quiet, desperate act of affirmation, a confirmation that they were still alive, even when a part of them had just been buried in the frozen ground. It was a shared prayer against the darkness, a moment of grace in a merciless world. The town's judgment, when the news inevitably trickled in, was swift and absolute. The child's death was seen as God's will, a just punishment. Eli's actions in taking Mara in, and now, in what they all assumed was his sin with her, were an affront to the community. The following Sunday, Reverend Brown stood at his pulpit, his face a thunderous mask of righteousness. He did not use their names, but everyone knew who he was talking about. He spoke of the viper in their midst, the man who harbored a sinner and had fallen into her trap. He spoke of a den of iniquity on the edge of their godly town, a stain that had to be cleansed. His voice rang through the church, and his congregation nodded in agreement, their faces hard and unforgiving. The judgment had been passed. Eli and Mara were outcasts, bound together not by promises or love, but by shame, sorrow, and the harsh judgment of a town that called itself Redemption. The hard Montana winter thawed into a muddy, hesitant spring, then blazed into a summer of long, hot days. The earth healed, and in its own quiet way, so did the small cabin by the creek. Several months passed. The hollowed-out look in Mara's eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve. The color had returned to her cheeks, and her hands, once the soft hands of a preacher's daughter, were now calloused and strong from churning butter, tending the garden, and scrubbing the cabin's rough-planked floor. The grief for the son she had held for less than an hour was still there, a permanent ache deep in her bones, but it no longer threatened to break her. She stayed. There was no discussion, no formal agreement. She simply became a part of the landscape of Eli's life. As constant as the wind and the mountains, they worked the land in a comfortable silence, a partnership that needed few words. He would mend the fences, and she would meet him at the door with a hot meal. She would patch his worn shirts, and he would chop a mountain of wood to see them through the nights. They shared his bed. It had started in the depths of their shared sorrow and continued out of a need that neither of them dared to name. It was not a union of promises or whispered declarations of love. It was a quiet pact against the vast loneliness of the plains, a solace found in the simple, honest warmth of another human body. In the darkness, they were just a man and a woman, holding back the ghosts of the past. By the light of day, they were two people running a ranch, their gazes meeting with a calm, unspoken understanding. The town of Redemption had rendered its verdict, and in their shared exile, they had found a fragile peace. That peace was shattered on a blistering morning in early August. Eli had ridden into town for a new buckle for a harness, the dusty street shimmering in the heat. As he tied his horse to the hitching post, he heard the train whistle, a mournful cry as it pulled into the station. He paid it no mind until he stepped out of the blacksmith's shop and saw the small crowd gathered by the tracks. They were not welcoming anyone. They were staring, their faces a mixture of curiosity and pious disapproval. At the center of their attention, sitting alone on a wooden crate on the station platform, was a woman. She was a specter, a ghost from another world. She wore a cream-colored lace wedding dress, now wilted and stained with dust from the journey. A delicate veil was pushed back from a face that was pale with shock. Her eyes, the color of cornflowers, wide and vacant. She looked like a porcelain doll left out in the sun, beautiful and utterly broken. Eli felt a familiar unease. He approached the station master, a portly man named Henderson, who was wiping his brow with a greasy kerchief. "What's the trouble?" Eli asked, his voice low. Henderson spat a stream of tobacco juice near the tracks. Trouble's the word for it, he grumbled, jerking a thumb toward the woman. That's the mail-order bride for Jedediah Sykes, the miner with the claim up in the hills. Eli frowned. I heard about Sykes. Found him at the bottom of a ravine yesterday. Cracked his skull. That's the one, Henderson said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She steps off the train this morning, all ready to be wed, and finds out her groom is cold in the ground. Bad luck, that one. Like she brought a curse with her on the train. Eli looked back at the woman. She hadn't moved, her hands clutching a small tapestry bag in her lap, as if it were the only solid thing in the world. The other women of the town kept their distance, whispering behind their hands. No one offered her a drink of water. No one offered her a word of comfort. She was an omen, a stranger tainted by death. Where's she going to go? Eli asked. Henderson shrugged. Not my problem. Sykes had no family to speak of. She's got no money, no people. The Reverend's wife already came by and said the church couldn't take her in, not with the circumstances being so suspicious. The word hung in the air. Suspicious. They were already blaming her. Eli felt the old, bitter anger rise in his throat. It was the same judgment, the same cruel certainty that had been cast upon Mara. He saw his brother's face, still and pale. He saw Mara, her shoulders shaking with sobs in the firelight. And he knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that he could not walk away. He approached the woman slowly, so as not to startle her. Ma'am, he said gently. She looked up at him, her blue eyes struggling to focus. My name is Eli Carter. Lenora? She whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. Lenora Bishop. I heard what happened. Miss Bishop, I'm sorry for your trouble. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. It's a hot day. You ought to be out of the sun. Can I get you some food? A ride somewhere? She shook her head, a small, lost gesture. There is nowhere to go. The finality in her voice decided it. You can come with me, he said, the words out before he had fully thought them through. I have a ranch a few miles from here. It's not much, but there's food and a clean bed. You can rest for a few nights. Figure out what to do next. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the trick, the angle. She saw only a man with a weathered face and weary, honest eyes. She gave a slow, exhausted nod. The ride back to the ranch was silent. Lenora swayed with the movement of the wagon, her gaze fixed on the endless horizon, a landscape so vast and brutal it must have seemed like the surface of the moon to a woman from back east. Eli was quiet, too, his mind racing. How was he going to explain this to Mara? What was he thinking, bringing another stray into their fragile sanctuary? Mara was in the yard, scattering feed for the chickens. When they pulled up, she froze, her eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of the woman in the dusty wedding dress sitting beside Eli. A flicker of something unreadable, fear, anger, betrayal, crossed her face before she smoothed it into a mask of neutrality. Eli climbed down from the wagon, his movements stiff. Mara, this is Lenora Bishop. She's had some trouble. Her intended, he passed away. She has nowhere to go. I said she could stay for a few nights. Mara's gaze shifted from Eli to Lenora, her eyes taking in the fine lace of the dress, the soft, pale hands, the look of utter devastation. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched, thick with tension. Eli could feel Lenora shrinking beside him, bracing for the rejection. Then, Mara's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly. She nodded toward the cabin. The stew is hot, she said, her voice flat but not unkind. She should eat. It was not a welcome, but it was an acceptance. Mara, more than anyone, understood the cold sting of shame and the terror of having nowhere to go. The first few days were awkward. Lenora was like a delicate bird trapped in a cage of rough-hewn logs. The harshness of frontier life was a constant shock to her. The silence of the plains terrified her. The cry of a coyote at night made her jump. Her hands were soft and pale, unsuited for any of the hard work the ranch required. She tried to help, but she fumbled with the churn and was clumsy with a needle. She was a creature of parlors and quiet streets, wholly unprepared for the brutal reality of this land. Her dream of a new life, of a respectable marriage and a home of her own, had died with a man she had never even met. Mara watched her with a guarded patience. There was a tension between them, a quiet simmer of two different worlds colliding. Mara, who had been broken and had forged herself into something strong and resilient, had little in common with this refined woman who seemed on the verge of shattering. But as the days passed, Mara began to help her, showing her how to knead bread without tiring, how to mend a seam so it would hold. She did it not with warmth, but with a practical, no-nonsense kindness. The thaw between them began one evening when Eli was out late, checking on a sick calf. The two women sat in the cabin, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire. Lenora was staring into the flames, her eyes welling with tears. "He sent me such beautiful letters," she whispered, more to herself than to Mara. "He wrote of the mountains, of building a home for us. He sounded like such a kind man." Mara stopped her mending. "You did not know him?" Lenora shook her head. "Only his letters. My father, he said it was a good match, a man with his own claim, a chance for a good life." She finally looked at Mara, her eyes pleading for understanding. "Now the whole town looks at me like I'm a curse." "This town is full of people who like to judge," Mara said, her voice low and edged with bitterness. "They feed on other people's pain. It makes them feel clean." In that moment, they were no longer two different women from two different worlds. They were two outcasts, branded by shame, their futures uncertain. They saw in each other a reflection of their own grief, their own loneliness, and they recognized the fierce, quiet kindness of the man who had offered them both a shelter from the storm. A week later, Eli came home late from a long day of riding the range. He was tired down to his bones, the dust a gritty film on his skin. As he approached the cabin, he heard a sound he had not heard in months, a sound so foreign and unexpected it made him stop in his tracks. Laughter. He pushed the door open quietly. Mara and Lenora were at the kitchen table, their heads bent together over a bowl of snapping beans. Lenora was telling a story, her hands gesturing animatedly, and Mara was laughing, not a small, polite chuckle, but a genuine, full-throated laugh that lit up her whole face. The sound was like a spring rain after a long drought. It was the first time he had seen either of them truly laugh. A strange, complicated feeling twisted in his gut. He should have been happy, a part of him was, but another part felt a pang of something. He was an outsider looking in on a world he had created but was not entirely a part of. The sight of them together, finding joy in each other's company, stirred something deep inside him. He looked at Mara, at the strength and warmth that radiated from her, and felt the familiar pull of loyalty and a bond forged in grief. Then he looked at Lenora, at the fragile beauty that was beginning to bloom again in the safety of his home, and he felt a powerful, protective urge that was dangerously close to desire. It was strong, confusing, and utterly forbidden. He quietly closed the door and went to tend to his horse, trying to distance himself from the emotions warring inside him. But the world outside would not let them be. The whispers in redemption grew louder, more venomous. Eli Carter's place was no longer just a refuge for a fallen woman. It was a den of sin, a household of loose morals. The story of the quiet rancher with two women under one roof became a sordid tale, embellished in the saloon and tut-tutted over in the mercantile. The trouble came to a head when Sheriff Brody rode out to the ranch. He was a thick-set man with a florid face and small, suspicious eyes, a man who enforced the town's prejudices more than the law. He found Eli chopping wood in the yard. "Carter," Brody said, not bothering to dismount. "I'm here about the woman, the Bishop girl." "What about her?" Eli asked, leaning on his axe. "There's talk," the sheriff said, letting the word hang in the air. Sykes' brother filed a complaint. He thinks it's mighty convenient that Jedediah ended up dead right before his rich bride arrived. Thinks maybe she lured him out there. An accomplice. Maybe. Eli's blood ran cold. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. Maybe so, Brody said, his eyes glinting. But a woman with no family, no connections, who suddenly finds herself the beneficiary of a dead man's claim, it looks bad. I'm thinking I might have to take her into custody, for her own protection. Of course, until we can get this sorted out. The threat was clear. Lenora would be locked in a cell, at the mercy of the town's rumors and the sheriff's whims. At that moment, the cabin door opened and Lenora stepped out, a basket of laundry in her hands. She froze when she saw the sheriff, her face draining of color. Eli stepped in front of her, placing himself between her and Brody's horse. He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the gun on his hip. He fought back with the only weapon he had left, his word, his honor. She is not going anywhere. Sheriff, Eli said, his voice quiet but as hard as granite. She is under my protection. He glanced back toward the cabin, where Mara now stood in the doorway, her face a pale, set mask. He looked back at Brody. Both of them are. The sheriff's face darkened. He was not used to being challenged. You're playing a dangerous game, Carter, harboring these women. The town won't stand for it. As if on cue, a wagon rattled up the track, carrying 4 men from town, their faces flushed with whiskey and self-righteousness. One of them was Sykes' brother, a wiry, ferret-faced man named Caleb. That's her, Sheriff, Caleb shouted, pointing a trembling finger at Lenora. The witch who killed my brother! The men climbed down from the wagon, their intentions ugly. Eli stood his ground. Go back to town, he said, his voice dangerously low. This is my property. We're just here to see justice is done, Caleb snarled, taking a step forward. One of the other men, drunk and bold, pulled a pistol from his belt. Get the woman, he yelled. Everything happened at once. Eli shoved Lenora back toward the cabin, shouting, Mara, get inside! He turned back to face the men, his hands empty and open at his sides. He would not start this fight. He would not be his brother. The drunk man fired. The shot went wide, but the sound of it, the crack and the whine of the bullet, ripped through the afternoon quiet. Caleb Sykes, emboldened, lunged at Eli. Eli sidestepped him, but another man swung a thick piece of wood, catching him on the shoulder. He staggered back, and in that moment, the drunk fired again. This time, the bullet found its mark. A searing, white-hot pain tore through Eli's left arm, just below the shoulder. He grunted, stumbling back against the cabin wall, the sudden warmth of blood soaking his sleeve. The sight of his blood, the raw reality of the violence, seemed to sober the men. Sheriff Brody, finally acting, drew his own weapon. That's enough, he roared. Get back in the wagon, all of you, now! Muttering, the men retreated, climbing back into their wagon and rattling away down the path, leaving a cloud of dust and the smell of gunpowder behind them. Inside the cabin, the world spun. Lenora was crying, her hands pressed to her mouth, while Mara moved with a focused, desperate calm. She ripped his sleeve open, her face grim as she examined the wound. It went through, she said, her voice tight, clean through the muscle. You're lucky. They cleaned and bandaged the wound, their hands working together. Eli sat slumped in a chair, the initial shock giving way to a throbbing, relentless pain. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of blood and violet. Later, as he lay on his cot, a fever starting to prickle his skin. The 2 women sat by the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. He watched them through half-closed eyes. Lenora was still shaken, but Mara was a study in quiet fury. The peace of their home had been violated, and the man who protected them had been hurt. Slowly, Mara stood up and came to his bedside. Lenora watched, her eyes wide. Mara knelt down beside the cot, her gaze locking with Eli's. She saw the pain in his eyes, but also the unwavering resolve. He had taken a bullet for them. He had stood against the whole town for them. Then she did something that changed everything. In front of Lenora, with the firelight dancing on the walls, Mara leaned forward and kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion or of pity. It was slow, deliberate, and searching. A kiss that spoke of loyalty, of shared battles, of a bond that ran deeper than words. And as she kissed him, her eyes flickered over to Lenora, and in that gaze there was no jealousy, no warning. There was only a quiet, profound, and terrifying invitation to something deeper, something none of them yet had a name for. The bullet graze on Eli's arm was a physical marker of the change. In the weeks that followed, as the wound healed from a raw, angry gash to a puckered, silver scar, the unspoken lines of their household also shifted and reformed. The fragile peace they had known was gone, replaced by something deeper, more complex, and infinitely more fragile. A quiet, cautious bond began to weave itself around the three of them, a tapestry of shared glances, unspoken understandings, and the constant humming awareness of each other's presence. At first, everything was defined by practicality. The attack had left them all shaken, keenly aware of their isolation and the hostility of the world just beyond their fence line. They drew inward, their small cabin becoming the entire world. Their days were a rhythm of shared labor. Lenora, with her neat, practiced script and mind for numbers, took over the ranch's meager bookkeeping. She sat for hours at the small kitchen table, a ledger book open before her, her brow furrowed in concentration as she made sense of Eli's scattered receipts and notes. It was the first time since her arrival that she seemed to possess a purpose that was uniquely hers, a way to contribute that did not involve the alien world of soil and livestock. Mara, in turn, took it upon herself to teach Lenora the ways of this new life. She did it with a gruff, almost reluctant patience. She showed her how to milk the placid Guernsey cow, guiding Lenora's soft, uncertain hands until she could draw a steady stream of warm milk into the pail without earning a kick from the irritated animal. She taught her to identify the herbs that grew wild by the creek, to churn butter until it was firm and yellow, to pluck a chicken with swift, efficient movements that made Lenora's stomach turn. The lessons were often awkward. Lenora was clumsy, her body unused to the physical demands of the ranch, but beneath the awkwardness, a cautious respect began to grow. Lenora was grateful for the knowledge, for the feeling of usefulness, and Mara, though she would never admit it, saw in Lenora's struggle a flicker of her own past self, a woman forced by circumstance to become someone she had never imagined being. Eli watched them, a silent observer. He moved through their world with a new weight on his shoulders. He was no longer just a man offering shelter. He was a protector, a guardian of this strange and unintended family. He felt the shift in the air, the way the women had begun to move around each other with a hesitant grace, the way they would sometimes share a low murmur of conversation when they thought he was not listening. He found his gaze lingering on them, on the fierce competence in Mara's hands as she kneaded dough, on the delicate curve of Lenora's neck as she bent over her ledger. He felt a deep, abiding loyalty to Mara, a bond forged in the crucible of grief. But he also felt a powerful, rising tenderness for Lenora, a desire to shield her from a world that had treated her so cruelly. The two feelings existed inside him, side by side, a confusing and dangerous cocktail of responsibility and desire. The small cabin, once a refuge, began to feel crowded with all the things left unsaid. The air was thick with unspoken questions, with the tension of three people living in a space too small for the size of their emotions. That autumn, Eli began to build a second cabin. He told them it was for storage, a place to keep saddles and gear through the winter. He told himself it was to give them all more space, a semblance of the propriety they had long since lost. But he knew, in the quiet, honest corners of his heart, that he was building it to put a wall between himself and the feelings that were growing too powerful to ignore. He worked with a grim, relentless determination, felling the pines himself, notching the logs with a precision born of a restless mind. The women helped where they could. Mara, strong and practical, helped him strip the bark from the logs. Lenora, eager to be useful, brought him water and meals, her presence a quiet counterpoint to the rhythmic thud of his axe. The new cabin rose slowly, a stone's throw from the first, its raw, yellow logs a testament to Eli's turmoil. When it was finished, it stood empty and silent, smelling of fresh-cut pine. That night, Eli moved his bedroll into the new structure. "It will be quieter for you both," he said, his voice carefully neutral. He could not meet their eyes. But the quiet he had sought was a hollow, lonely thing. The new cabin was cold, its silence filled with the sighing of the wind through the pines. He lay awake for hours, staring into the darkness, the space around him feeling vast and empty. He could hear the faint murmur of the creek, the distant call of an owl, but the sounds he had grown accustomed to, the soft rustle of Mara shifting in her sleep, the gentle rhythm of Lenora's breathing, were gone. He had created distance, but it brought him no peace. In the main cabin, the two women lay in their separate beds, the space Eli had left behind feeling like a gaping wound. They, too, were awake, listening to the same night sounds, each lost in her own thoughts. They had grown used to the solid, reassuring presence of him sleeping by the fire, a silent guardian against the darkness. Without him, the cabin felt larger, colder, and less safe. The space he had tried to create between them only served to highlight how deeply their lives had become entwined. None of them slept well apart. The failed experiment lasted less than a week. Eli moved his bedroll back to its familiar spot on the floor by the hearth, offering no explanation. None was needed. The shared look of relief in the women's eyes the next morning was all the acknowledgement that was necessary. The seasons turned again, and summer returned to the plains, hot and breathless. The days were long and thick with heat, and the nights offered little relief. The air in the cabin grew heavy, charged with a simmering tension that had been building for months. One sweltering night, when the moon was a silver sliver in a sky full of stars, the heat was too oppressive for sleep. Eli lay on his bedroll, the thin blanket kicked aside, his shirt sticking to his skin. The door to the cabin was propped open to catch any hint of a breeze, but the air was still and warm. He heard a floorboard creak. He opened his eyes and saw a silhouette in the dim moonlight filtering through the doorway. It was Mara. She moved with a silent, deliberate grace, her bare feet making no sound on the wooden floor. She came to his side and stood over him for a long moment, her expression unreadable in the shadows. Then, without a word, she knelt down and lay beside him on the narrow bedroll, her body a line of warmth against his. Eli's breath caught in his throat. He did not move, did not speak. This was different from the desperate, grieving comfort they had shared after her child's death. This was a choice, a statement. He turned to her, and in the faint light, he saw the raw need in her eyes, a need that mirrored his own. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, his senses filled with the scent of her skin, of soap and wood smoke. From the shadows of the small hallway that led to the sleeping loft, Lenora watched. She had been woken by the heat and had come down for a drink of water when she saw Mara's cot was empty. Now she stood frozen, half hidden by the doorframe, a silent witness. A storm of emotions warred within her. She saw the two people who had saved her, the two people who had shown her more kindness than she had ever known, finding solace in each other's arms. A part of her felt a sharp, bitter pang of jealousy, the lonely ache of the outsider, but another part of her, a deeper, more honest part, felt a pull of undeniable desire. The sight of them together, the raw tenderness of their embrace, stirred a longing in her that was as powerful as it was shameful. She felt a flush of heat that had nothing to do with the summer night, torn between her longing and the strict morals of her upbringing. She retreated back into the shadows, her heart pounding a frantic, guilty rhythm against her ribs. The days that followed were thick with a new, unspoken awareness. The secret of that night lay between the three of them, a shimmering, invisible veil. Lenora could not meet Eli's eyes, and she found herself watching Mara with a mixture of awe and fear. Mara, for her part, seemed calmer, more centered, as if a long-held tension within her had finally been released. The breaking point came a few days later. Lenora and Mara were sitting on the porch in the late afternoon, shelling peas into a large wooden bowl. The repetitive, rhythmic task was a comfort, a small anchor of normalcy in a sea of emotional turmoil. Lenora's hands trembled, spilling a few peas onto the porch floor. She finally broke the silence, her voice barely a whisper. "I have dreams," she confessed, her gaze fixed on the bowl in her lap. "At night, I should not have them." Mara stopped shelling, her hands still. She waited. "I dream of him," Lenora whispered, the words tasting like sin on her tongue. "Of his hands, on me." She finally dared to look up at Mara, her eyes swimming with tears, fully expecting a flood of anger, of righteous indignation. She expected to be cast out, to be called a harlot, to be sent away from the only home she had. But Mara's expression was not one of anger. It was one of profound, weary sadness, of a deep and unsettling understanding. She looked at Lenora, at this beautiful, fragile woman who had also been broken by the world. And she saw not a rival, but a reflection of her own loneliness, her own need. She had lived her entire life under the harsh judgment of men who claimed to know God's will. She would not become one of them. She reached out and placed her hand over Lenora's, stilling their trembling. "Then dream with me," she said, her voice soft and low, a sound that was both a comfort and a challenge. That night, the heat did not break. A stillness settled over the cabin, a sense of anticipation, of a threshold about to be crossed. After the fire had died down to glowing embers, Mara rose from her cot. She went not to Eli's bedroll, but to Lenora's. She took Lenora by the hand, her grip firm and gentle. Lenora's heart hammered against her ribs, but she did not resist. She allowed herself to be led across the room to where Eli lay, his eyes open and watchful in the darkness. He had seen it all, had felt the shift, had understood the silent conversation that had passed between them on the porch. He sat up, making room for them. Mara lay down on one side of him, and then, with a hesitant, trembling grace, Lenora lay down on the other. For a long time, they just lay there, three separate souls in the darkness, the space between their bodies electric with fear and possibility. This was not a moment of easy passion. It was a slow, painful bearing of old scars. It was in the way Eli's hand, calloused and rough, gently brushed a tear from Lenora's cheek. It was in the way Mara's fingers traced the puckered scar on Eli's arm, a silent acknowledgement of the price he had paid for them. It was in the way Lenora's soft hand found Mara's, a silent plea for forgiveness and acceptance. There were tears, quiet and salty in the darkness. There were long, shuddering pauses, moments of hesitation where they simply held each other, their breathing the only sound in the room. This union was not about the joining of bodies, but about the melding of three broken, lonely souls. It was a deep, emotional, and trembling act of forbidden tenderness, a quiet rebellion against a world that would have condemned them all. In the first light of dawn, gray and soft, no one ran, no one turned away in shame. They rose and dressed in silence, the air in the cabin charged with a new, profound gravity. They sat together on the porch, three figures huddled close, sharing a single blanket against the morning chill. They did not speak. They simply watched the sun rise, a fiery orange ball cresting over the distant mountains, flooding the prairie with light. A new day had begun. A new life had begun. But the world would not grant them their peace. Word of their arrangement, as it was bound to do, spread like a prairie fire. The whispers in redemption, once a murmur, became a roar of outrage. The story of the cowboy and his two women became a local legend, a cautionary tale of sin and depravity. One afternoon, a buggy rattled up to the cabin. It was the new minister who had replaced Mara's father, a young, zealous man named Reverend Miller. He stood before them on the porch, his face pale with righteous fury, his Bible clutched in his hand like a weapon. He directed his words to Eli. "I have come to warn you, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice trembling with indignation. "Your household is an abomination in the eyes of the Lord in this community. If you do not cast these women out and repent your sins, you will be excommunicated from the church and shunned by all decent folk." Eli stood slowly, his face like stone. "This is my home. Reverend, these women are under my protection. You can take your warnings and your judgment back to town." The minister, flustered by Eli's calm defiance, could only stammer a final threat before retreating to his buggy. The visit left a pall over the cabin. The fragile peace of their new reality had been shattered by the world's hatred. That evening, as they sat around the fire, Lenora's composure finally broke. "We have to leave," she said, her voice choked with fear. "We can sell the ranch, go somewhere new where no one knows us. We can start over." The idea of running was ingrained in her. It was the only way she knew to escape shame. Mara, however, shook her head, her expression resolute. She had been cast out once. She had been shamed and nearly broken. She had clawed her way back to a life of dignity and purpose. "No," she said, her voice low but unyielding. "I will not run anymore. This is our home. I will not let them chase me from it." Eli listened to them both, his heart torn. He looked at Lenora, her face pale with terror, and his instinct was to protect her, to take her far away from the cruelty of this place. Then he looked at Mara, her chin set in stubborn defiance, and he felt a surge of pride and admiration for her strength. One wanted to flee, the other to fight, and he stood between them, the protector of their impossible love, with no clear path forward. The uneasy truce held through the first chill of autumn. The days grew shorter, the air tasting of wood smoke and coming frost, and the small world of the cabin settled into a quiet, domestic rhythm. The anger from the town seemed to have receded to a low, distant grumble, but the peace was an illusion, thin as the first layer of ice on the creek. The trouble, when it returned, did not come in the form of a drunken mob, but with the cold, unyielding authority of the law. Sheriff Brody returned, not alone this time, but with a deputy and an official-looking document. He handed it to Eli, his expression a mixture of grim satisfaction and procedural duty. It was a warrant for Lenora's arrest. Caleb Sykes had formally filed charges. The town's whispers had found a voice, and that voice accused Lenora Bishop of murdering her fiancé, Jedediah Sykes, by poison. Lenora's face went ashen. She swayed on her feet, and Mara had to put a steadying arm around her. The charge was absurd, a fiction spun from malice and suspicion, but the warrant in the sheriff's hand was terribly real. "You cannot do this," Eli said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "It ain't my choice. Carter," Brody said, avoiding his gaze. "A formal complaint has been made. The circuit judge will be here in a month. Until then, she has to be held." The image of Lenora locked in the town's squalid, one-room jail, at the mercy of Brody and the town's venom, was more than Eli could bear. "She is not a flight risk. She can stay here under my watch." Brody hesitated. He looked at Lenora, who was trembling, her eyes wide with a terror that seemed to age her in an instant. Perhaps a sliver of decency pricked his conscience, or perhaps he simply wanted to avoid a confrontation. "Fine," he conceded. "But if she is not in that courtroom when Judge Hargrove arrives, I will hunt you down myself, Carter, and I will burn this place to the ground." The moment the lawmen were gone, Lenora collapsed into a fit of weeping, her body racked with a terror so profound it seemed to steal the air from her lungs. Mara held her, murmuring soothing words, her own face a mask of cold fury. This was the town's judgment made manifest, a weapon aimed at the most vulnerable among them. Eli acted with a swift, grim resolve. The next morning, he cut the 10 best steers from his herd, the strong, healthy 2-year-olds that represented his entire year's profit and his hopes for the next. He drove them to a neighboring rancher 20 miles away, a man who cared more for the quality of cattle than for town gossip, and sold them for cash. It was a ruinous sale, gutting the heart of his herd, but he did not hesitate. With the money tucked into a leather pouch, he rode to the county seat and hired the only lawyer within 100 miles, a man named Marcus Abernathy. Abernathy was a sharp, weary-eyed man from back east who had come west for his health and stayed for the money. He listened to Eli's story in his office that smelled of dry paper and stale cigar smoke. His fingers steepled under his chin. "The charge is flimsy," Abernathy said when Eli had finished. "Poison? The man fell into a ravine and cracked his skull. They would need a body, an autopsy, evidence. They have none of that. They only have the word of a resentful brother." A wave of relief washed over Eli. "So, you can get it dismissed?" Abernathy held up a hand, his expression sobering. "It is not that simple, Mr. Carter. A trial out here is not always about facts. It is about sentiment, and the sentiment in redemption is decidedly against you." He leaned forward, his gaze direct. "And that brings us to the real problem. Your household." Eli's jaw tightened. "What about it?" "You are living with 2 women, neither of whom you are married to. One is the former preacher's daughter, cast out for bearing a child out of wedlock. The other is the accused herself. Forgive my bluntness, but a jury of God-fearing men from this county will see your home as a den of iniquity. They will see Miss Bishop not as a grieving fiancée, but as a fallen woman, capable of anything. Your testimony on her behalf will be tainted. Your very presence will poison the case." The lawyer's words landed like stones in Eli's gut. The sanctuary he had built to protect them had become the cage that would trap them. The quiet, defiant life they had forged was now the very thing that would be used to condemn Lenora. He rode home under a sky the color of lead, the lawyer's words echoing in his mind. He explained the situation to Mara and Lenora that night, his voice flat with a despair he could not hide. Lenora grew even paler, a fragile lily wilting before their eyes. The hope that had flickered within her was extinguished. For 2 days, a heavy, suffocating silence hung over the cabin. They moved like ghosts, the unspoken fear a constant presence. Lenora barely ate, her eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. Then, on the 3rd evening, as they sat by the fire, Mara spoke. "I will speak for her," she said, her voice quiet but clear in the still room. Eli and Lenora both turned to look at her. "What do you mean?" Eli asked. "At the trial," Mara said, her gaze steady, "I will speak. Not as a witness to the facts, but as a witness to her character, and to the character of this town." "Mara, no," Lenora whispered, her voice trembling. "You cannot. They will tear you apart. They will throw everything back in your face." "Let them," Mara said, a fire kindling in her eyes. "I have lived under their judgment my whole life. I have hidden from their whispers and their cold stares. My father condemned me on the steps of his church. I let my shame silence me. I will not be silent anymore. They want to judge her. Then they will have to look at me, and I will show them what their judgment does to a person." Eli looked at her, at the woman who had buried a child and her own past, who had rebuilt herself from the ashes of her old life. He saw a strength in her that humbled him. It was a terrifying risk. It could backfire, cementing the jury's prejudice. But he also saw the unshakable rightness of it in her eyes. He would not stand in her way. The day of the trial, the small courthouse in Redemption was packed. It felt as though the entire county had turned out for the spectacle. Eli, Mara, and Lenora walked through the crowd together, a small island in a sea of hostile, curious faces. They sat on a hard wooden bench, Lenora trembling between them, her hands like ice. The prosecution presented its case, a flimsy patchwork of innuendo and suspicion. Caleb Sykes took the stand, his voice dripping with false grief as he painted Lenora as a cold, calculating woman who had murdered his brother for his mining claim. There was no evidence, only accusations. But in the stuffy, judgmental air of the courtroom, the accusations felt like they had weight. When it was time for the defense, Abernathy called only one character witness. "I call Mara Brown." A murmur rippled through the crowd as Mara walked to the stand. She did not look like the shamed, fallen woman of their gossip. She stood tall, her worn dress clean and pressed, her hair neatly braided. She met the gaze of the 12 men in the jury box, her expression calm and resolute. Abernathy asked her a few simple questions, establishing how she knew Lenora. Then he said, "Tell the court, in your own words, what you know of Miss Bishop's character." Mara took a deep breath, her eyes sweeping over the faces in the room, the women who had whispered about her, the men who had looked at her with pity or contempt, her father's former congregation. "I know that Lenora Bishop came to this town with a heart full of hope," she began, her voice steady and clear, carrying to every corner of the room. "She came here to build a life, to be a wife and a neighbor, and before her feet touched the ground, that hope was turned to ash. Her intended was dead, and she was left alone, without a penny, without a friend in the world." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I know what it is to be alone in this town. I know what it is to be judged. You all know my story. You whispered it in the mercantile and discussed it after church. You decided who I was without ever speaking a word to me. You called me a sinner, and in your eyes, that is all I will ever be." Jeers started to bubble up from the back of the room, but they died down as she continued, her voice gaining strength. "You are doing the same to her, because she is a stranger, because she was touched by misfortune. You have decided she is a curse, because she found shelter in a home you do not approve of. You have decided she is a criminal. You look at her, and you do not see a woman grieving. You see only what your own fear and prejudice want you to see." She turned her gaze directly to the jury. "The man who gave us that shelter, Eli Carter, he did not ask about our past. He did not consult the town's opinion. He saw 2 women in desperate need, and he acted with a simple Christian charity that I have not seen anywhere else in this town, least of all in the church. He offered us a home when we had none. He defended us when we were threatened. And for his kindness, you have branded him a sinner, too." Her voice dropped, becoming low and damning. "You have been so busy looking for the sin in our home that you have not seen the poison in your own hearts. This trial is not about justice. It is about cruelty. It is about your need to have someone to look down on, so that you can feel righteous. You want to punish Lenora? You are not punishing a murderer. You are punishing a woman for being lonely, for being afraid, and for surviving. If that is a crime in this town, then we are all guilty." She finished, her gaze unwavering. A profound, stunned silence filled the courtroom. No one had expected this. They had expected tears, pleas, a desperate defense. They had not expected the quiet, unshakable power of the truth. She had not defended Lenora's actions. She had laid bare the soul of the town, and they all saw their own reflection in her words. Abernathy did not ask another question. The prosecution had no response. The judge, a man who had seen his share of frontier justice, instructed the jury. They were out for less than an hour. The verdict was not guilty. A choked sob escaped Lenora's lips, and she sagged against Eli, the tension of the past month draining out of her in a single, shuddering wave. The town was divided. As they left the courthouse, some people turned their backs on them, their face set in hard, unforgiving lines. But others, a surprising number, met their eyes with a newfound, grudging respect. A few of the women even gave Mara a hesitant, almost imperceptible nod. She had shamed them, but she had also spoken a truth they could not deny. That night, the cabin was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a storm that has finally passed. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, gentle glow on the three of them. They sat close together on the floor, their shoulders touching, drawing strength and comfort from each other. Eli looked at the two women who had become his life. He looked at Lenora, her face tear-stained but peaceful for the first time in weeks, and at Mara, her profile strong and serene in the firelight. He felt a love for them so fierce and so deep it was a physical ache in his chest. The world had tried its best to tear them apart, and it had failed. It had only forged them into something stronger. He knew what he had to do. The law, the church, the whole world could condemn them. But in his heart, there was only one truth. He cleared his throat, his heart pounding. They both turned to look at him, their expressions questioning. "I ain't a man for fancy words," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "I cannot give you what the world sees as a proper life. We will always be outcasts to some, but I can give you all I have. My home, my strength, my heart." He looked from Mara's searching eyes to Lenora's wide, hopeful ones. "I ain't the law," he said, his voice thick with a conviction that came from the very core of his soul. "But I swear before heaven, I love you both, and I ain't choosing." For a moment, there was only the sound of the fire. Then, a single tear traced a path down Mara's cheek. She did not brush it away. A slow, radiant smile spread across her face, a smile of such profound, unadulterated joy that it took Eli's breath away. She simply nodded, the tears now flowing freely. Lenora let out a soft, breathy sound, a whisper of a laugh and a sob all at once. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, Eli, yes." The next day, in private, they held their ceremony. There was no preacher, no congregation. There was only the three of them and the vast, silent Montana sky as their witness. Eli had spent the morning at his forge, carefully shaping two old horseshoe nails, heating them in the coals and hammering them on his anvil. He twisted the rough, dark metal into two simple, identical rings. They were not made of silver or gold, but of iron, strong, humble, and forged in fire. Like the bond between them, he placed a ring on Mara's finger, and then one on Lenora's. They fit perfectly. Then Mara took his hand, and Lenora took his other, and the three of them stood in a circle before the hearth, their hands joined. No vows were spoken. None were needed. The commitment was in their eyes, in the firm clasp of their hands. It was unorthodox. It was a scandal. But it was the most heartfelt and holy ceremony any of them had ever known. Their wedding night was a culmination of everything they had survived. It was tender and reverent, a slow, emotional rediscovery of each other. The passion that had been born of grief and confusion was now transformed into something sacred, a celebration of their survival. In the quiet darkness, with their bodies and souls entwined, the last of their walls came down. It was Mara, so often guarded and stoic, who finally broke open. She whispered into the darkness about the tiny son she had lost, the grief she kept locked away so tightly. She told Eli how, in burying her child, he had also buried her shame, how his simple, unwavering kindness had given her back a dignity she thought she had lost forever. And Lenora, her voice soft against Eli's chest, confessed the crushing loneliness she had carried her whole life, the feeling of being a disappointment, a fragile thing to be married off. She spoke of the shame of being a failed bride, a shame so deep she had felt she was drowning in it. "I thought my life was over," she whispered, her tears warm on his skin. "But you and Mara, you did not just save me from the town. You saved me from myself. Eli held them both, one in each arm, their shared warmth a bulwark against the cold and judgmental world outside. He felt their tears and their whispered confessions settle into his own heart, filling the empty spaces that his guilt over his brother had carved out so long ago. He had started out just trying to do a single decent thing, and somehow it had led him here, to a love so vast and unconventional he had no name for it. He only knew that for the first time in his life, he was truly home. The vows they had made were not to a god in a church, but to the harsh, unyielding land itself. And that year, the land demanded a heavy price. The summer that followed their private wedding was a season of fire and dust. The sky, once a brilliant Montana blue, turned a pale, hazy brass. The sun was not a source of life, but a hammer that beat down on the plains, cracking the earth into a mosaic of fissures. The creek, their lifeline, shrank to a muddy trickle. The grasses turned brittle and brown, and the small garden that Mara and Lenora tended with such care began to wither, its leaves curling in on themselves as if in prayer for a rain that never came. Hardship settled over the ranch like the dust that coated everything, a fine, gritty film that got into their food, their water, and their lungs. The threat of ruin was a constant, silent guest at their table. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their bodies aching, their faces grim. Eli spent his days driving the thinning herd farther and farther in search of scarce pasture, his heart a tight knot of worry as he watched the cattle grow gaunt. In this crucible of sun and scarcity, Mara became the quiet, unyielding backbone of their survival. She had a deep, instinctual knowledge of the land, a wisdom born of her own hard past. She knew how to stretch a sack of flour to last a month, how to find the last bit of moisture deep in the roots of withered plants, how to render tallow for candles and soap when they could not afford to buy them. She moved with a tireless, fierce economy, her spirit as tough and resilient as the prairie sagebrush. When Eli's hope began to fray, and Lenora's spirit flagged under the relentless heat, it was Mara's quiet, steady presence that held them together. She did not offer words of comfort. She offered the tangible proof of survival. A hot meal on the table, a mended shirt, the simple, profound promise that they would endure. Lenora, in turn, found her own way to fight back, not with her hands, but with her mind. During the long, stifling evenings, after the chores were done, she would sit by the light of a single, flickering candle, a pen and paper before her. Her delicate Eastern script, once used for writing hopeful letters to a man she would never meet, now became a weapon. She began to write. She wrote about what she knew, about what she had lived. She wrote about the quiet desperation of women in frontier towns, women who were seen as property, as saints or sinners, but rarely as people. She wrote about the casual cruelty of gossip, the crushing weight of judgment, and the courage it took for a woman to simply exist in a world that sought to define her. She did not write of her own story directly, but her experiences gave her words a raw, undeniable power. She sent her articles, sealed with wax and a prayer, to a progressive newspaper in Chicago her father had once subscribed to, a paper known for championing unpopular causes. To her astonishment, they published the first one, then a second. Her words, written in the deep isolation of the Montana plains, had found a voice in the bustling, modern world back east. She wrote under a pseudonym, but the act of writing, of shaping their pain into a coherent argument, transformed her. The fragile, broken woman who had stepped off the train in a dusty wedding dress was gone. In her place was an advocate, a woman who had found her purpose in the ink that stained her fingers. One of her articles, a particularly sharp piece on the legal vulnerability of mail-order brides, drew unexpected attention. A letter arrived, not from a reader, but from the editor of the paper, a traveling journalist. A man named Silas Croft was passing through the territory and was intrigued by her perspective. He wanted to know more about the life that had inspired such forceful writing. He wanted an interview. The request threw their quiet world into a turmoil. Croft arrived a week later, a fast-talking, ambitious man from New York with a notebook full of questions and eyes that missed nothing. He was fascinated by their remote existence, and it did not take him long to piece together the truth of their household. He wanted to tell their story. Eli's immediate refusal was instinctive. "No," he said, his voice flat. "Our life is our own. It is not a spectacle for your readers." He had fought too hard for their privacy to give it away. Mara was equally wary, her face a guarded mask. She trusted the outside world even less than Eli did. But it was Lenora who argued for it. "He is going to write something anyway." "Eli," she said, her voice earnest, "is it not better that he write the truth? Our truth? You always said you hoped our story might help someone. Perhaps this is how—" Eli looked at her, at the passion and conviction in her eyes, and then at Mara, who gave a slow, reluctant nod of agreement. He finally, grudgingly, agreed. The interview was a strange, stilted affair conducted on their porch. Croft's questions were probing, sometimes impertinent, but Eli answered them with a simple, unadorned honesty. He spoke of his respect for both women, of the home they had built not out of sin, but out of necessity and a shared decency. Lenora spoke eloquently of the ways society discarded women who did not fit its narrow expectations, and Mara sat between them, a silent, powerful presence whose silence said more than any words could. The article appeared a month later, a full-page feature in the Sunday edition of the Chicago paper, syndicated to other papers across the country. The headline was sensational. Designed to sell copies, "The Cowboy with Two Brides, a Scandalous Union or a New Morality in the Wild West." The story stirred a national storm. It was all Croft had promised and more. Letters began to arrive at the small post office in Redemption, addressed simply to the Carter Ranch. Some were filled with venom, quoting scripture and condemning them to eternal damnation. Others were filled with a startling, heartfelt praise. They came from women who had been cast out, from men living in quiet arrangements that defied convention, from people who felt like outcasts and had found, in their story, a flicker of courage. Some praised their bravery, most ridiculed their supposed depravity. Overnight, their small, private rebellion had become a public debate. They were no longer just outcasts. They were a cause, a symbol, a scandal of national proportions. And with that fame, the trouble they had outrun finally caught up to them. A man from Mara's past returned to Redemption. His name was Frank Miller, the son of the mercantile owner, and he had once been considered Mara's most ardent and suitable suitor before her fall from grace. He had left town to work for the railroad, but now he was back, wearing the badge of a deputy sheriff. His face hardened with a self-importance that had replaced his youthful earnestness. He had read the article. He saw it not as a story of survival, but as a confirmation of Mara's degradation. He saw himself as her savior. He rode out to the ranch one afternoon when Eli was out on the range. He found Mara near the barn, pitching hay. "Mara," he said, dismounting, his voice thick with a condescending pity. "I came as soon as I heard this life you are living. It is a disgrace. Your father, God rest his soul, would be heartbroken." Mara stopped her work, her eyes narrowing. "My life is no concern of yours. Frank—" "But it is," he insisted, taking a step closer. "I still care for you. I can get you out of this. You do not have to live like this, sharing a man with another woman like some animal. I can give you a respectable life, a home. You can be my wife." The offer was an insult, a repudiation of everything she had built. He was not offering her love. He was offering her a cage, a way to restore his own sense of order. "I have a home," she said, her voice like ice. "And I have a husband. I do not need you to save me." "He is not your husband," Miller's voice rose, his face flushing. "He is a sinner who has taken advantage of you. It is my duty, for your own good, to take you away from this place." He reached for her arm. his sense of righteous duty overriding her clear refusal. Before his fingers could touch her, Eli's voice cut through the air, low and deadly. "Get your hand off her." Eli had been riding in and had seen Miller's arrival. He had dismounted and approached in silence. He stood there now, his face a thunderous mask, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Miller straightened up, his hand dropping to the pistol on his hip. "This is not your concern. Carter, this is between me and Mara. I'm a deputy sheriff." "You are on my land," Eli said, his voice flat. "And you are threatening my wife. I am telling you, for the last time, get on your horse and ride away." "I am not leaving without her," Miller snarled, his pride and jealousy getting the better of him. It was the final straw. For years, Eli had carried the ghost of his brother, the memory of a saloon brawl and his own damning hesitation. He had avoided fights, had turned the other cheek, had swallowed his anger. But this was different. This was not a drunken squabble over a card game. This was a man threatening his home, his family. The promise he had made to himself to never raise his fists again was a promise made by a different man, a lonely, guilt-ridden man. This man, the man who loved Mara and Lenora, had a different promise to keep. He moved faster than Miller could have anticipated. He did not go for his gun. This time, he would not hesitate. He lunged forward, and his fist, a hammer forged by years of hard labor, crashed into Miller's jaw. The deputy staggered back, surprise and pain on his face. He tried to draw his weapon, but Eli was on him. A whirlwind of contained fury unleashed. It was not a skillful fight. It was a raw, brutal, and blessedly short confrontation. Eli landed 2 more hard blows to Miller's gut, doubling him over, and then a final, definitive punch that sent him sprawling into the dust. Eli stood over him, his chest heaving, his knuckles bloody. Miller lay on the ground, groaning, his face bruised and his dignity shattered. He had expected to fight a quiet, guilt-ridden rancher. He had found a protector with the fury of a grizzly. Humiliated and beaten, he staggered to his feet, climbed onto his horse, and rode away without another word. Eli watched him go, the adrenaline slowly draining out of him, leaving him trembling. He looked at his bloody hands, and for the first time since his brother's death, he felt no guilt. He felt only a fierce, clean certainty. He had done what had to be done. That night, the air in the cabin was thick with an unspoken, volatile energy. The violence of the afternoon hung between them, a tangible thing, after their silent meal. Mara stood up. She looked at Eli, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made his breath catch. She took him by the hand, her grip like iron, and pulled him wordlessly out of the cabin and toward the barn. Inside, the barn was dark, smelling of hay and horses and the coming night. Moonlight streamed through the cracks in the walls, striping the floor with silver. Mara pushed him back against a rough-hewn support beam, her hands coming up to frame his face. "He could have killed you," she whispered, her voice a ragged, furious sound. "He was not going to touch you," Eli said, his own voice hoarse. Her expression was a storm of emotions, fury, fear, and a love so powerful it was terrifying. "Do you know what it is to watch the man you love stand against the world for you?" she gritted out, her thumbs tracing the hard line of his jaw. Again and again. She did not wait for an answer. She kissed him, and her kiss was not gentle. It was a clash of teeth and tongues, a kiss full of the fire of her fury and the desperation of her fear. It was a kiss that tasted of loyalty and survival. She pulled his face down to hers, whispering her love for him not like a prayer, but like a vow, like a curse against anyone who would ever try to tear them apart. What happened between them in the hayloft was not a gentle union. It was rough and tender all at once, a desperate, cathartic release of all the fear and anger of the day. It was a raw, elemental claiming, a confirmation of a bond that had been tested by violence and proven unbreakable. Their bodies spoke a language of fury and devotion, their movements fueled by a passion born of loss and survival. There were tears, his and hers, that mingled with the sweat on their skin. Tears of relief, of love, of the overwhelming weight of all they had endured to find each other. Later, as they lay tangled in the hay, their breathing slowly returning to normal, the barn door creaked open. Lenora stood silhouetted in the moonlight. She carried a blanket and a canteen of water. She had not come to intrude, but to comfort. She came to them and gently draped the blanket over their shoulders. She knelt beside them, her presence a calming, gentle balm after the storm. She did not speak. She simply laid her head on Eli's shoulder, her hand finding Mara's in the darkness. She cradled them both, gathering the frayed, torn pieces of their hearts and holding them together, a silent testament to the fierce, impossible, and unbreakable love that bound the three of them as one. The years, like the river, wore new paths through the land. The harsh edges of their notoriety were smoothed by the steady, relentless passage of seasons. The Carter Ranch, once a subject of scandal and whispers, slowly, imperceptibly, transformed. It did not happen overnight. It happened in small, quiet acts of decency that radiated outward from their small cabin. It began with the outcasts, a widow whose family had cast her out after her husband's death, left with 2 small children and nothing but a name. She appeared at their door, desperate and ashamed, and Mara took her in without a word, giving her a place in the barn and a share of their meager meals until she could find her feet. Then came an old prospector, his leg crushed by a rock fall, who Eli found delirious by the side of the road. They nursed him back to health, asking for nothing in return. Their home, forged in defiance of social codes, became a quiet haven for those who had no other place to go. It became known, in hushed tones at first, then in open acknowledgement, as a place of peace. The hatred from the townsfolk did not so much disappear as it simply ran out of fuel. It is hard to maintain a righteous fury in the face of unwavering, practical kindness. People began to see not the scandal, but the results of their life together. They saw a ranch that was well kept, if poor. They saw children who had been given shelter leaving with full bellies. Slowly, grudgingly, respect began to replace judgment. The story of the cowboy and his 2 brides was still told, but now the tone was different, less of a cautionary tale, and more of a local legend, tinged with a grudging admiration. As their place in the world settled, so too did they settle into themselves, their love giving them the courage to build something lasting. Lenora, her spirit no longer shackled by fear, found her true calling. She turned the second cabin, the one Eli had built in his turmoil, into a small schoolhouse. She taught the children of the outlying ranches, the ones too poor or too remote to attend the school in town. She taught them their letters and their numbers, but she also taught them the things she had learned from Mara and Eli, that kindness was a form of strength, and that a person's worth was not measured by the opinion of others. Mara, in turn, became a mentor. Young women, daughters of struggling ranchers or newly arrived brides bewildered by the harshness of the land, began to seek her out. She taught them the skills that had ensured her own survival: how to preserve food for the winter, how to deliver a calf, how to read the sky for a coming storm, how to be self-reliant in a world that expected them to be dependent. She did not teach with words of encouragement, but with the steady, capable guidance of her hands, empowering a new generation of women to be as unyielding as the land they lived on. Eli grew older. The lines on his face deepened, etched not by guilt, but by sun and wind and the slow, steady work of a lifetime. The haunted look in his eyes, the ghost of his brother, was finally gone, replaced by a quiet, thoughtful peace. He was a man who had found his center. He would often sit on the porch in the evenings, smoking his pipe, watching the 2 women who were the anchors of his world. He would watch Mara, her hands buried in the soil of her garden, a fierce and tender nurturer. He would watch Lenora, reading to a small group of children on the schoolhouse steps. Her voice a gentle, melodic counterpoint to the ever-present wind. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in strokes of orange and purple, he watched them working together, moving in the easy, unspoken rhythm of people whose souls are intertwined. A feeling of profound, overwhelming gratitude washed over him, a feeling so powerful it was almost a physical weight. He murmured to the fading light, his voice thick with an emotion he could never have named in his younger years. "Never thought I'd be this lucky." But the land, which had given them so much, had one more trial for them. The following winter, a sickness swept through the territory. It came on the wind, a fever that left its victims weak and breathless, their lungs filling with fluid. It moved through redemption like a phantom, leaving grief and fear in its wake. And one cold, gray morning, it came to their door. It took Lenora first. She woke with a chill she could not shake, and by noon, she was burning with a fever that left her delirious. Her breath grew shallow and ragged, each gasp a painful struggle. The fragile, refined constitution that had been so unsuited to the West now made her terribly vulnerable to the disease. Eli did not leave her side. He sat by her bed in a constant, unwavering vigil, the rest of the world ceasing to exist. He bathed her brow with cool water, his large, rough hands impossibly gentle. He forced spoonfuls of thin broth between her cracked lips, willing her to live with every ounce of his being. He watched as she grew weaker, her life force seeming to ebb away with each shallow breath, and a cold, primal fear unlike any he had ever known gripped his heart. Mara worked tirelessly, her face a grim, determined mask. She brewed herbal remedies, kept the fire roaring, and managed the ranch on her own, her energy fueled by a desperate, terrified love. On the third night, as Lenora's breathing became a faint, terrifying rattle, Mara reached her breaking point. She stumbled out of the cabin into the bitter, moonless night and fell to her knees in the snow. She lifted her face to the starless, unforgiving sky, and, for the first time since her father had cast her out, she prayed. It was not a plea for mercy from the judgmental God of her childhood. It was a raw, furious bargain, a desperate challenge to the heavens. "You can't have her," she sobbed, her voice a ragged tear in the silent night. "You have taken enough from me. You took my son. You took my name. If you need another soul, then take mine. I will trade my life for hers. Just let her live." She stayed there for a long time, her tears freezing on her cheeks, her prayer a raw, open wound offered up to the vast, indifferent darkness. And somehow, in the deepest hour of the night, the fever broke. Lenora's breathing deepened, becoming steadier, and she fell into the first real, healing sleep she had known in days. She had survived. A week later, when she was finally strong enough to stand, Eli wrapped her in a thick wool blanket and carried her out onto the porch to sit in the weak winter sun. As he stepped out of the cabin, a supply wagon from town was passing on the road. The driver, a man who had once jeered at him, stopped and stared. He saw the stoic, unreadable Eli Carter, the man who had faced down a mob and beaten a deputy, with tears streaming openly down his face. He was sobbing, great, silent, racking sobs of pure, unadulterated relief, his face buried in Lenora's hair as he held her fragile body as if she were the most precious thing in the world. The driver turned his wagon around and went back to town. He told everyone what he had seen. He told them not with malice or gossip, but with a quiet, humbled awe. Judgment did not turn to acceptance in an instant. It simply ended. That day, the town finally understood that what they had called a scandal was, in fact, a love so profound it was beyond their comprehension, a love that had been tested by fire and had not burned. In the final scene of their long story, years later, the sun shines down on a peaceful, thriving ranch. There is a new gravestone on the small rise overlooking the creek, near the lone pine tree. But it does not mark a new death. It is a small, carefully carved stone of white marble that Eli had ordered all the way from Helena. It is a memorial. The inscription reads, "Daniel, loved, remembered, home." Beneath the shade of the pine tree, 3 figures sit on a weathered wooden bench. Eli, his hair now more silver than brown, sits in the middle. On one side is Mara, her face lined with the wisdom of a life fully lived, her hand resting in his. On the other is Lenora, her beauty softened by age and a deep, abiding peace, her hand also clasped in his. 3 hands, calloused and soft, strong and gentle, are entwined. One life, one home. Their days are a quiet rhythm of work and love. Their nights still a shared sanctuary of warmth and tenderness. Their love, once a furious, desperate act of survival, has mellowed into a deep, steady, and unwavering constant, as much a part of the landscape as the mountains on the horizon. And here, in the home they built together, in the family they chose, shame, at last, has no place. Thank you for listening to our story. We encourage you to comment with where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.